My name is Colette Hayes, and I was 28 the night my mother tried to trap me under a $6,000 restaurant bill to prove she still owned me. The invitation was supposed to be a private dinner to reconnect after 5 years of dead silence. But when I pushed open the mahogany doors of the private dining room, 20 members of my extended family were already wiping truffle butter from their mouths, surrounded by empty bottles of vintage champagne. My mother smiled at me, tapped a leather check folder against the table, and announced to the room that her successful daughter was picking up the tab. What I whispered to the manager 3 minutes later is the reason I am telling you this story. Welcome back to Fluffy Revenge, where quiet boundaries break the loudest manipulation. If you have ever been treated like a bank account by the people who are supposed to protect you, this one is for you. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. The wind coming off Lake Michigan that November evening carried the kind of biting cold that searches for weakness. I stepped through the revolving brass doors of the Wellington, a downtown Chicago steakhouse, where the air smelled of dry-aged beef, charred oak, and old money. In Illinois, a premier steakhouse operates as a theater where people perform their status. I gave my name to the host and followed his tailored back past leather booths filled with men closing corporate deals. My pulse maintained a steady, disciplined rhythm. Working 60 hours a week as a nurse anesthetist in a trauma center conditions you to keep your heart rate even when the monitors start to scream. I approached this dinner with the exact same clinical detachment. I had built a 5-year wall of silence between myself and my parents, bought with the exhaustion of unpaid debts and relentless financial demands. When my mother Brenda called a week earlier, her voice thin and fragile, asking for just the 3 of us to share a quiet meal and heal, I agreed against my better judgment. I expected a quiet booth, a shared appetizer, a difficult conversation. The host paused before a set of frosted glass double doors and pushed them open. The illusion of a private reconciliation vanished instantly. There was no quiet booth. A sprawling table took up the entire span of the private room. My older sister Valerie sat near the head, swirling a glass of deep ruby wine. My brother Derek leaned back in his chair, laughing with an uncle I had not seen since my nursing school graduation. The heavy clink of expensive crystal rang out before a single person offered a hello. They had not waited for me. The feast sprawling across the white linen bordered on gluttony. 3 multi-tiered seafood towers sat dismantled crushed ice, weeping beneath hollowed oyster shells and cracked lobster claws. Silver platters held the gnawed bone-in remnants of tomahawk ribeyes. 4 empty bottles of champagne stood clustered near my father Gary. Brenda caught sight of me in the doorway. She did not wear the face of a mother seeking forgiveness. Her eyes sparked with the thrill of a hunter watching a snare snap shut. She stood, picked up a silver oyster fork, and tapped it against her water goblet. The sharp chime cut through the room. 20 faces pivoted toward the door. "Look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," Brenda announced. Her voice carried a theatrical warmth that stopped far short of her eyes. She gestured toward me, sweeping her arm over the wreckage of the meal. "Our successful medical professional." Brenda picked up the black leather check presenter resting near a floral centerpiece and tapped the corner against the table. "You are covering this right, sweetie, to celebrate the family being back together." I stood motionless on the plush carpet. My gaze tracked the empty bottles, the picked clean towers, the sheer volume of consumed luxury. I did not flush. I did not stammer. My training simply took over. I evaluated the room the way I evaluated a crashing patient, detached, analytical, and solely focused on the necessary intervention. The entire room hung in a suspended breath. 20 pairs of eyes fixed on my face, waiting for the familiar script to play out. They expected the version of me from 5 years ago. They expected the girl who used to apologize for inconveniencing people who were actively using her. They relied on the memory of a younger sister who handed over her emergency savings to cover unpaid rent and impounded cars just to keep the peace at Thanksgiving. My mother stood at the head of the mahogany table with the dark leather check folder in her hand, her smile fixed and rigid, performing the role of the benevolent matriarch. She believed public embarrassment functioned as a lock and key. She thought a crowd of aunts, uncles, and cousins would compel me to open my wallet to avoid a scene. In her mind, the trap was flawless. I did not move toward the empty chair they had left for me at the far end of the room. I simply watched them. When you administer anesthesia, your primary job is to control the environment. You monitor the steady rhythm of the heart, the rise and fall of the chest, and you never let the chaos of the surgical field dictate your internal temperature. I applied that exact discipline to my mother's dining room theater. I took a slow, measured breath. The scent of charred fat, clarified butter, and stale wine hung heavy in the air. Every item scattered across that table represented a deliberate choice to exploit me. The empty bottles of vintage champagne alone accounted for more than a month of my rent back when I was a struggling student. I saw the remnants of imported care, the gold leaf garnishes on the dessert plates, and the sheer volume of excess that a group of people only orders when they are certain someone else is footing the bill. They had treated the menu like a blank check, banking on my fear of confrontation to subsidize their greed. My father, Gary, avoided my gaze, entirely choosing instead to inspect a water spot on his crystal goblet. He had always preferred to let my mother do the dirty work while he reaped the financial benefits. Valerie leaned forward in her seat, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips, clearly ready for the show. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a subtle shift near the service station. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stood watching the spectacle unfold. He was the floor manager. I glanced at his subtle brass name tag. Vince. He possessed the quiet, weathered posture of a man who had spent 30 years navigating the unspoken power dynamics of wealthy Chicago families. He had seen handshake deals made marriages dissolved, and trust funds squandered over these white linen tables. Men like Vince did not survive decades in high-end hospitality without developing a flawless radar for human behavior. He watched the way my mother held the bill like a weapon. He saw my father hiding behind his wine glass. He understood the predatory nature of the gathering. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back. His face an unreadable mask, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. He recognized an ambush. He knew exactly what kind of people sat at this table, and he knew exactly what was being done to the woman standing in the doorway. When I made eye contact with him, I did not project panic. I projected the quiet authority of a woman who was in total control of her own agency. I broke my silence, but I did not speak to my mother. I turned my back to the family and walked directly toward the service station. The soft thud of my boots on the plush carpet was the only sound in the room. The triumphant smile on my mother's face began to waver, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. I closed the distance between myself and the manager. Vince did not flinch or step away. He leaned in slightly, offering me the professional courtesy of a private exchange. I kept my voice entirely level, pitching it so low that only he could hear the words over the ambient noise of the restaurant. "I did not order this," I whispered. "I am not paying for this. I am leaving now." The whisper itself felt like shedding a heavy skin. For years I had believed that asserting myself meant engaging in a shouting match, matching their volume to prove my point. My medical training taught me otherwise. The most powerful person in a trauma bay is never the one screaming. It is the one who assesses the damage, dictates the solution in a clear voice, and executes the plan without hesitation. Vince looked at me for a fraction of a second. He did not ask questions. He did not ask for a credit card to hold the balance or suggest a payment plan. He simply gave a slow, imperceptible nod. With a smooth, practiced motion, he reached out and slid a sleek leather menu cover directly over the duplicate check presenter, resting on his station, obscuring it from view. It was a silent seal of approval, an acknowledgement between two professionals that a firm boundary had been drawn and respected. I pivoted back to face the table. The confusion in the room had mutated into palpable tension. My mother had lowered the check presenter, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the dark leather. Derek stopped laughing. The uncle beside him set his heavy crystal glass down on the table with a dull thud. They had expected tears. They had expected a quiet, desperate plea to split the bill. They had expected total capitulation. I gave them nothing. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and delivered my parting words with the same clinical precision I used to confirm a medication dosage. "I hope you all enjoy your evening." I did not wait for a response. I turned on my heel, pulled the lapels of my wool coat tight against my chest, and reached for the heavy mahogany door. As I pulled the door open, the silence broke. The sound of panic replaced it. I heard the sharp scrape of a wooden chair pushing back against the carpet. I heard my father's voice, suddenly stripped of its detached comfort, hiss my mother's name. I heard Valerie's shrill voice demanding someone go after me. They were doing the math. The reality of 20 consumed lobsters, prime steaks and vintage champagne was crashing down on them. The sharp, chaotic rustling of 20 people realizing they were trapped echoed into the hallway. They did not have the funds to cover that table. Gary's credit cards were notoriously close to their limits, and Brenda spent her disposable income on maintaining appearances rather than building savings. They were about to face a very different kind of Chicago hospitality. The safety net had just walked out of the room, leaving them suspended over a $6,000 drop. I stepped out of the restaurant and into the freezing wind, leaving them to fall. The heater blasted dry air against my frozen knuckles as I steered my car onto Lakeshore Drive. The dark expanse of Lake Michigan stretched out to my right, swallowing the city skyline reflections into a black, icy void. The adrenaline that had carried me out of the steakhouse began to recede, leaving behind a familiar metallic taste of betrayal. My phone rested in the center console. It remained silent for the moment. The shock of my departure was likely still echoing around that private dining room. They were currently trapped in the agonizing realization that the dinner was real, the prices were real, and the girl who always paid the tab was gone. People who hear about estranged families often assume a sudden cinematic fight shattered the relationship. They imagine a singular dramatic argument involving thrown plates and screamed insults. The reality is much quieter. It is a slow, methodical bleed. For my entire adult life, my role in the Hayes family was not a daughter. I was a contingency plan. I was the reliable Midwestern safety net trained from birth to equate hard work with familial duty. My mind drifted to a specific evening 10 years ago. I was 18, holding a yellowed financial aid award letter from the state university. I had worked 3 part-time jobs during high school to save for nursing prerequisites. That piece of paper was my ticket out. I brought it to the kitchen table, proud of the scholarships I had earned. My father, Gary, did not even look at the numbers. He snatched the letter from my hand, glanced at the college emblem, and tossed the document directly into the trash can next to the sink. He declared that nursing was a trade, not a career, and they needed my savings to cover a mortgage gap that month. His bad investments took precedence over my education. I retrieved that crumpled paper after they went to sleep, smoothed out the creases, and realized my future would only exist if I fiercely guarded it. I funded my own degree. While I balanced anatomy labs and clinical rotations, my family treated my work ethic as their personal slush fund. My older sister Valerie floated through her 20s, launching one disastrous boutique venture after another. Whenever her inventory gathered dust or her commercial rent came due, Brenda would call me using a practiced, fragile tone, demanding I help my sister. I picked up extra overnight shifts cleaning hospital floors to cover Valerie's lease. When Gary lost thousands on speculative real estate ventures, my emergency fund kept their electricity running. They masked this financial parasitism as regional loyalty. Family takes care of family. That was their mantra, wielded exclusively when they needed my bank account. The breaking point arrived 5 years ago. I was in the most grueling phase of my nurse anesthetist training. I survived on 4 hours of sleep a night, living in a cramped studio apartment that smelled perpetually of bleach and cheap ramen noodles. Every dollar I possessed went toward tuition and survival. My eyes were ringed with dark shadows. My hands trembled from caffeine and sheer exhaustion. In the middle of pharmacology midterms, Brenda called. She did not ask about my health or my exams. She informed me that the family was planning a 2-week Caribbean cruise to celebrate Gary's birthday. She needed me to co-sign a personal loan to finance the trip because their credit was overextended. I remember sitting on my thrifted mattress, staring at a textbook diagram of the human respiratory system, realizing I could not breathe. I was drowning in my own life to keep them afloat in their fantasies. I said no. It was a 2-letter word I had never used with them before. The silence on the phone stretched into a hollow void. I explained I was barely eating, that taking on debt for a luxury vacation would ruin my chance at graduation. Brenda did not offer sympathy. She offered vitriol. She called me selfish. She accused me of abandoning the people who raised me just because I thought I was better than them now. Gary took the receiver and told me not to bother coming home for the holidays. They cut me off. The irony was breathtaking. They banished the only person keeping them solvent because she refused to sink with them. That estrangement was the greatest gift they ever gave me. It taught me how to construct boundaries out of steel. It showed me that their affection was entirely conditional, tied directly to my willingness to be exploited. The lane markers blurred together on the asphalt as I pressed the accelerator. That 5-year exile proved the steakhouse ambush tonight was not a lapse in judgment. It was a calculated predatory relapse. They had invited me to dinner not because they missed their daughter, but because they had run out of other people's money. They assumed the passage of time had softened my resolve. They thought my new salary as a certified professional meant my pockets were deeper and my guilt was heavier. They bet my career success made me desperate for their validation. They were wrong. I watched the illuminated skyline of Chicago reflecting off the freezing water. The sea is a beautiful, unforgiving grid of steel and concrete, a place that rewards resilience and crushes hesitation. I had spent half a decade building a life that mirrored this environment. I rented a secure apartment in the South Loop. I paid my student loans on time. I earned the respect of surgeons who trusted my clinical judgment when a patient's vitals plummeted. I had built a quiet, impenetrable peace. The thought of letting Gary and Brenda crack that foundation for a feast of oysters and Wagyu beef made my grip tighten on the leather steering wheel. Valerie and Derek were just as complicit. They had sat at that mahogany table tonight, eagerly consuming luxuries they could never afford, wearing tailored clothes paid for by invisible debts. They had watched Brenda drop that leather check presenter in front of me with greedy anticipation. They were adults capable of working, capable of reading a menu, and calculating the total. Yet they remained comfortable letting their younger sister bear the weight of their indulgence. The sick realization washed over me that they had probably planned the menu before I even confirmed my attendance. They had researched the wine list. They had tasted the caviar in their minds, knowing I would foot the bill. My decision to walk away was not born of spite. It was an act of profound self-preservation. If I had handed over my credit card, I would have validated their delusion. I would have signaled that the 5 years of silence were just a temporary pause, and the bank was open for business once again. I refused to let my Midwestern work ethic become their weapon. I refused to bleed so they could drink champagne. I signaled and took the exit toward my neighborhood. The streets grew quieter, lined with dormant trees, braving the winter chill. I pulled into the underground parking garage of my building, the concrete walls offering a familiar, comforting silence. I parked, turned off the ignition, and sat in the quiet cabin of my car. The engine ticked as it cooled. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the final traces of the restaurant's chaotic energy dissipate. Then the silence broke. The screen of my smartphone resting in the center console flared to life, casting a harsh, pale glow across the dark interior of the car. A text message banner flashed across the top. Then another. Then a missed call notification. The device began to vibrate continuously, a frantic, angry buzzing that rattled against the hard plastic. The shock in the private dining room had worn off. The bill had finally arrived at the table. The reality of a $6,000 deficit was crashing down on 20 people who had no means to escape it. I did not reach for the phone immediately. I simply watched the screen light up with the frantic consequences of their own actions, preparing to witness the fallout of the trap they had set for themselves. The heater in my sedan pushed dry, warm air against my frozen knuckles, creating a stark contrast to the icy digital assault lighting up my center console. I sat in the chilled cabin and watched the screen glow. The notifications cascaded in a relentless waterfall of panic. My mother dialed first. I let the call route directly to voicemail. Then my brother called. Then my sister. The rhythmic buzzing against the hard plastic formed a percussive soundtrack to their unfolding disaster. I pressed the play icon on the first audio message, maintaining the calm detachment I employed when reviewing a critical patient chart. Brenda spoke in a hushed, breathless whisper, attempting to conceal her panic from the surrounding patrons. The ambient noise of the steakhouse leaked through the speaker. I heard the faint clatter of heavy silverware and the low, sophisticated murmur of adjacent tables. She begged me to turn the car around. She framed my departure as a hilarious misunderstanding, suggesting I was playing a prank on the family. She promised to order me a fresh cut of beef if I just walked back through those mahogany doors. The underlying tremor in her tone betrayed her performance. She was terrified. The waiter had likely just delivered the leather folio to the table. I pictured the exact sequence of events playing out in that private dining room. Vince, the seasoned floor manager, would not have waited long. He operated with the precision of a trauma surgeon. He would have approached the head of the table, holding the check presenter securely against his side. He would have bypassed my empty chair and placed the bill directly next to my father. Gary would have chuckled, waving a manicured hand toward the door, telling Vince that his daughter was stepping out to take an urgent hospital phone call and would settle the tab momentarily. Vince would have stood his ground. He possessed zero tolerance for affluent bluffs. A text from a younger cousin arrived on my screen, confirming my suspicion. The message blamed me for embarrassing them in front of the management. According to the angry green bubble, Vince leaned down and informed Gary that I had exited the building and would not be returning. The illusion of my compliance shattered right there on the white linen. The table descended into chaos. My phone vibrated again, this time delivering a text from Derek. He demanded I wire funds immediately via a payment app, typing his rage in all capital letters. The urgency in his erratic grammar painted a vivid picture of my father sweating under the dim chandelier lighting. Gary would have reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulling out a premium credit card. He would have handed it to Vince with a strained, confident smile. Vince would have returned 2 minutes later, holding the plastic rectangle, quietly stating the transaction had been declined. The panic spread like a contagion across the mahogany table. Another cousin texted their words, dripping with frantic venom. They detailed how Valerie tried to slip out of the room. My sister, clutching her designer handbag, likely claimed she needed to use the restroom to powder her nose. She aimed to abandon the rest of them before the financial reality set in. The establishment employs discreet but highly observant security personnel. A man in a dark suit intercepted Valerie near the coat check. He politely but firmly guided her back to the private dining room in full view of the other diners, informing her that no one from their party could leave until the balance was settled. They were effectively detained. Brenda left a second voicemail. The hushed, pleading tone had vanished entirely. Her voice cracked tight with raw, unfiltered fear. She practically choked on her words, stating the management was threatening to contact the local authorities. Theft of services in Illinois is a severe offense, especially when the total exceeds felony thresholds. A $6,000 unpaid tab would result in immediate arrests. The restaurant gave them a rigid ultimatum. Pay the bill right now or face a squad car waiting by the valet stand. They had to empty their financial reserves right there at the table. I leaned my head against the headrest and imagined the profound humiliation of that moment. 20 people dressed in their finest evening wear frantically transferring funds on their smartphones. They had to scour checking accounts, drain meager savings, and pool their collective resources. They handed Vince a stack of 6 different credit cards. Every single one of those cards would be maxed out by the end of the night. They had to calculate the tip while swallowing their shattered pride. The waitstaff watched them divide a luxury feast into a dozen desperate, humiliating transactions. The nature of the conflict mutated in that very instant. This was no longer a dispute over a free meal or a family misunderstanding. I had inflicted the one injury they could never forgive. I had exposed their insolvency to the world. They had strutted into that prestigious establishment playing the role of wealthy socialites only to be reduced to begging relatives for pocket change to avoid handcuffs. I had destroyed their social facade. Their embarrassment curdled into a dark, potent desire for retribution. My mother left a third and final audio message. The recording captured the sound of harsh wind, indicating they were standing on the freezing pavement outside the restaurant. The valet was likely retrieving their aging sedans. Brenda did not beg this time. Her voice dropped an octave, vibrating with unadulterated venom. She called me a traitor. She listed every sacrifice she had ever made during my childhood, weaponizing basic parental duties as unpaid debts. She vowed to make sure the rest of the extended family knew exactly what kind of monster I had become. She promised to isolate me from everyone I loved. I deleted the voicemails one by one. The digital trash bins swallowed their rage, leaving the cabin of my car in a profound, heavy silence. I felt no guilt. I felt a startling, radiant clarity. The tumor of their entitlement had been lanced. They were finally experiencing the consequences of their own consumption. My phone screen lit up one last time. The notification displayed a direct message from my father. Gary rarely typed his own messages, preferring to let my mother dictate family policy. This message was brief, devoid of punctuation, and dripping with a cold, calculated fury. I stared at the harsh white text glowing in the dark interior of my vehicle. The message read, "You are going to pay for this. I promise you." The morning sun pierced through the slate-gray clouds hanging over the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. I pulled my vehicle into the designated employee parking structure of the medical center. The transition from the freezing urban wind into the climate-controlled corridors of the surgical wing offered a familiar comfort. The environment smelled of chlorhexidine, an industrial floor cleaner. A sterile sanctuary very far removed from the decadent wreckage of the steakhouse. Inside the staff locker room, the metallic clang of doors echoing off tiled walls masked the initial onset of the digital assault. I traded my wool coat and civilian clothes for crisp navy blue scrubs, tying my hair back into a severe practical knot. As I reached for my identification badge, the smartphone resting on the wooden bench began to vibrate. It did not emit a brief singular pulse indicating a routine message. The device shuddered, continuously sliding a fraction of an inch across the varnished wood with each sustained buzz. I picked up the device and swiped past the lock screen. A cascade of social media notifications flooded the display, overlapping one another in a frantic rush of digital urgency. I had been tagged in a video post that was rapidly gaining traction. The thumbnail image featured my sister. Valerie sat behind the steering wheel of her luxury SUV, the interior lighting deliberately adjusted to highlight the glossy sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. She wore an oversized knit sweater, cultivating an aesthetic of fragile vulnerability. I tapped the screen, allowing the audio to play at a low volume. Valerie looked directly into the camera lens, her voice wavering with practiced emotion. She spun a narrative that inverted reality with breathtaking audacity. According to her broadcast, I had begged the extended family to gather at a prestigious restaurant to celebrate a recent career milestone. She claimed our aging parents living on fixed incomes traveled downtown solely to support my success. The climax of her performance arrived when she described how I inexplicably vanished before the main courses arrived. She painted a tragic picture of Gary and Brenda, humiliated and confused, forced to drain their meager savings to cover an exorbitant bill they never intended to incur. She utilized all the modern cultural buzzwords to maximize the impact. She called my behavior toxic. She labeled my departure an act of elder abuse. She warned her followers about the dangers of unchecked narcissism. Below the video, the comment section festered with righteous indignation. Extended relatives, cousins who only reached out when they needed free medical advice, and aunts who thrived on suburban gossip formed an immediate mob. They accepted Valerie's broadcast as undisputed gospel. The digital jury convened, deliberating my guilt in real time, and swiftly delivered a verdict of total condemnation. They posted lengthy paragraphs questioning my moral character, demanding I issue a public apology and reimburse our parents immediately. This tactic was not new. It was merely a digitized, amplified version of a childhood survival mechanism. When we were younger, if Valerie shattered a vase in the living room, she would proactively run to our mother, sobbing, claiming I had pushed her into the pedestal. She understood early on that whoever controlled the initial narrative controlled the consequences. The family always aligned with the loudest victim. The strategy remained identical. Only the audience had expanded from a suburban living room to a global network. I locked the screen and slid the device into the deep pocket of my scrub top. I walked out of the locker room and entered the preoperative holding area. The contrast between the manufactured hysteria on the internet and the tangible reality of my profession grounded me. I approached curtain bay number 4, where a 60-year-old man named Arthur lay on a narrow stretcher awaiting a complex orthopedic procedure. His knuckles were pale as he gripped the thin cotton blanket. True fear lived in this room, raw and unedited, unlike the performative distress Valerie projected from her leather car seat. I introduced myself, reviewing his chart and explaining the sedation protocol. As I reached for the sterile supply cart to prepare his intravenous line, the smartphone in my pocket vibrated again. I pulled it out to silence the ringer, glancing briefly at the illuminated glass. A text message from Aunt Joanne glared back at me. The words were sharp and venomous. She demanded to know how I could treat my own flesh and blood with such cruelty, insisting I had broken my mother's heart. I did not pause my clinical routine. I held the device in my left hand. Using my right thumb, I swiped across her contact name, tapped the settings icon, and selected the option to block the caller. The digital barrier snapped into place. I placed the silenced phone on the metal tray, picked up a blue rubber tourniquet, and returned my attention to Arthur. "You might feel a small pinch," I told him, keeping my voice smooth and reassuring. I palpated a prominent vein on the back of his hand, swabbed the skin with alcohol, and slid the catheter in with flawless precision. I secured the line with clear tape, unbothered by the silent war raging inside the plastic casing resting inches away. Throughout the morning shift, my focus belonged entirely to the surgical field. I sat behind the sterile drape in operating room 3, monitoring the rhythmic green peaks of an electrocardiogram and the steady hiss of the ventilator. A patient's life depended on my ability to interpret minute fluctuations in their vital signs. Administering anesthesia requires a meticulous balance, keeping the human body suspended in a state of controlled unconsciousness. I applied that same principle of rigorous regulation to my personal life. The instinct to defend oneself against a public smear campaign is primal. The urge to post the receipts, to expose the empty champagne bottles, to scream the truth into the digital void burns hot in the chest. But I understood the anatomy of a social media mob. They do not seek the truth. They seek the spectacle of a fight. Arguing with a fabricated narrative only provides it with oxygen. If I engaged, I would validate their hysteria. A defensive response is the currency a smear campaign requires to survive. I refused to finance their drama. By withholding my reaction, I starved the fire. I let them shadowbox against a wall of total silence. In American culture, ignoring a public call-out is often viewed as an admission of guilt, but it is actually the ultimate assertion of power. It demonstrates that the attacker's opinion holds zero structural value in the target's life. My silence stripped Valerie of the ensuing conflict she desperately craved to boost her engagement metrics. It denied my parents the satisfaction of watching me squirm under the weight of social pressure. When my scheduled lunch break arrived, I sat in the staff lounge with a lukewarm cup of cafeteria coffee. I unlocked my device. The barrage had continued, but the tone of the messages had shifted. The initial wave of righteous anger had curdled into palpable frustration. The family group chats, which I monitored without reading, were churning with manic energy. My lack of participation was driving them to the brink of irrationality. They needed me to bleed in the town square to feel vindicated for the $6,000 they lost the night before. Gary's ominous text from the previous night lingered in my memory. The digital shame campaign was designed to break my resolve and force a capitulation. Because the strategy was failing to produce the desired submission, their desperation would inevitably mount. If they could not compel me to surrender through a Wi-Fi connection, they would have to bridge the physical distance. The digital boundary remained secure, but the concrete walls of the hospital were public access. As the afternoon light began to wane outside the break room window, I knew the illusion of safety was temporary. The afternoon stretched into the early evening, casting a cool gray light through the tall windows of the surgical wing. My shift was nearing its end, but the tempo of a trauma center never truly decelerates. I walked down the central corridor, chart in hand, heading toward the family waiting area to update a spouse on a successful spinal block. The polished linoleum floor gleamed under the fluorescent ceiling panels, reflecting the sterile, orderly world I had built for myself. This hospital was my fortress. Within these walls, I was not a daughter or a sister burdened by endless demands. I was a highly trained professional whose decisions carried the weight of human survival. The waiting room was the quiet space furnished in muted blue tones where families sat with tight shoulders and anxious eyes. I approached the reception desk to check a bed assignment with the charge nurse, a veteran named Sarah, who managed the floor with iron efficiency. Before I could speak to her, a sharp, incongruous sound broke the hushed atmosphere. Squeak. Squeak. The noise was distinct, grating against the pristine hospital tile. I turned my head. The sliding glass doors leading from the public elevators had parted, allowing a rush of damp winter air into the corridor. Walking through them was my older brother, Derek. His sneakers, slick with melted Chicago slush, dragged across the immaculate floor, leaving muddy tracks in his wake. Derek had always fancied himself the heir apparent of the Hayes family, despite a resume riddled with unfinished degrees and short-lived sales jobs. He carried the unearned arrogance of a son who had never been told, "No, a boy perpetually insulated from consequence by our parents' checkbook." While I was pulling double shifts to pay for my nursing textbooks, Gary and Brenda were busy covering Derek's car payments and bailing him out of bad leases. He operated under the delusion that the world owed him a living, and by extension that I owed him my compliance. He spotted me at the reception desk. His face flushed with a blotchy, uneven red, and he closed the distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. He did not bother to lower his voice to respect the clinical environment. He intended to weaponize the public setting. "You think you can just ignore us?" Derek barked, his voice echoing off the walls, drawing the startled attention of two waiting families and a passing surgical resident. "You think you can humiliate Mom and Dad and just turn your phone off?" I stood perfectly still. I did not shrink back, nor did I reach out to hush him. I observed him with the same detached focus I reserved for an agitated patient coming out of anesthesia. His breathing was rapid, his shoulders hunched. He was banking on the conventional rules of polite society. He assumed that as a professional woman in her workplace, I would be terrified of a scene. He calculated that I would drag him into a private hallway, placate his anger, and offer a compromise just to protect my reputation among my colleagues. He severely underestimated the boundaries I had forged over the last 5 years. "Derek," I said, keeping my tone flat and devoid of emotion, "you need to lower your voice and leave this facility." My calm demeanor only seemed to fuel his outrage. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. The scent of cheap cologne and stale coffee radiated from his damp jacket. "I am not going anywhere until you fix what you did," he sneered, jabbing a finger toward my chest, stopping just short of making physical contact. "You owe them $6,000. You are going to take your phone out right now, and you are going to wire that money directly into Dad's account." I maintained steady eye contact, offering zero reaction to his demand. The silence stretched tight and uncomfortable for everyone in the room except me. "Or what?" I asked softly. Derek smiled, a cruel, triumphant expression. "Or I walk right into those administrative offices down the hall. I find your department head, and I tell your boss exactly what kind of person you really are. I will tell them how you abandoned your elderly parents at a restaurant, stuck them with a bill they could not pay, and left them to deal with the police. Let us see how much they trust you with patient care after they find out you are a sociopath." He crossed his arms, waiting for the threat to land. He anticipated the moment my professional facade would crack. He expected me to negotiate, to ask for his routing number, to buy his silence to save my career. Instead of addressing him, I shifted my gaze a few inches to the left. Sarah, the charge nurse, was standing behind the reception counter, her hand hovering near the telephone, her eyes darting between Derek and me. She had witnessed countless family disputes bleed into the hospital over the years. She knew the protocol, but she was waiting for my cue. I did not whisper. I did not pull my brother aside to save his dignity. I projected my voice clearly across the waiting room, utilizing the sharp, authoritative tone I used when calling for an emergency intubation kit. "Sarah," I said, my words crisp and distinct. "We have a hostile trespasser in the surgical waiting area. He is currently threatening hospital staff and disrupting patient care. Please call security and have him escorted off the premises immediately." Derek's smug expression dissolved into a mask of pure shock. His jaw slacked. He had brought a match to burn down my career only to discover I had flooded the room with water. "Colette, are you crazy?" He stammered, his volume dropping as the reality of the situation dawned on him. "I am your brother." "You are a security risk," I corrected him. The response from the hospital infrastructure was swift. Within 45 seconds, the heavy double doors at the far end of the corridor swung open. Two uniformed security guards, both broad-shouldered and unsmiling, strode purposefully into the waiting area. Sarah pointed directly at Derek. The guards flanked him without hesitation. One of them placed a firm, uncompromising hand on Derek's elbow. "Sir, you need to come with us right now," the guard stated, leaving no room for debate. Derek tried to shake off the grip, his face burning with a sudden, overwhelming humiliation. He looked around the room. The surgical resident was watching him with undisguised contempt. The families in the waiting chairs stared at him like he was a dangerous nuisance. His grand plan to shame me had catastrophically backfired. The public audience he had hoped to weaponize was now the jury witnessing his eviction. "Get your hands off me," Derek muttered, his bravado crumbling as the second guard stepped closer silently, promising an escalation if he resisted. They marched him toward the exit. The squeak of his wet sneakers on the tile floor sounded much less aggressive in retreat. He cast one final venomous glare over his shoulder before the sliding glass doors closed behind him, shutting him out into the freezing Chicago evening. The waiting room fell silent again, save for the steady hum of the ventilation system. Sarah looked at me, raising one eyebrow in a silent question of support. I offered her a curt nod of gratitude, smoothed the front of my scrub top, and picked up the patient chart from the counter. I walked down the hall and delivered the post-operative update to the waiting spouse, keeping my voice gentle and my clinical details precise. I returned to my shift without missing a single beat. My colleagues did not ask questions. In the medical field, personal drama is secondary to patient stability, and my ability to neutralize the threat efficiently only cemented their respect. Yet as I scrubbed my hands at the sink an hour later, the cold water running over my skin, a deep, unsettling realization began to take root in my mind. The digital smear campaign was a standard tactic. It was lazy, cheap, and entirely expected. But Derek showing up at my workplace, risking a physical altercation, a trespassing charge, and profound public humiliation crossed a dangerous new threshold. My family was arrogant, but they were also fundamentally cowards who avoided real-world consequences. Derek's reckless ambush reeked of something far more urgent than wounded pride. People do not risk arrest over a bruised ego and a restaurant bill. They take those kinds of risks when they are cornered. The sheer desperation in Derek's eyes suggested a panic that a $6,000 deficit could not fully explain. There was a missing variable in this equation. The dinner trap, the frantic voicemails, the digital mob, and now the hospital ambush. It was too much sustained effort for a simple shakedown. They needed money, yes, but the intensity of their pursuit indicated a looming deadline. I dried my hands on a paper towel and stared at my reflection in the mirror. They were hiding something much larger than a steakhouse receipt, and I needed to find out exactly what it was before they struck again. The drive back to the South Loop offered a necessary transition between the clinical demands of the surgical wing and the unsettling reality of my brother's ambush. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement usually cleared my mind, but tonight the equations refused to balance. Derek's frantic intrusion violated every rule of his own self-preservation. My family operated on the core principle of minimal effort for maximum yield. Risking a trespassing charge in a crowded waiting room contradicted their entire playbook. They were fundamentally cowards who hid behind polite societal norms and digital screens. Their sudden willingness to shatter those conventions indicated they were terrified of a much larger consequence. I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped into the quiet sanctuary I had meticulously funded and furnished. The space remained exactly as I left it, a stark contrast to the chaos they kept trying to inject into my life. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door and walked directly to the kitchen island. I pulled my laptop from my leather work tote, flipped the lid open, and let the device awaken. The cold glow of the screen illuminated the dark room, casting sharp, pale light across the granite countertop. I sat on a bar stool and stared at the search engine prompt. In medicine, when a patient presents with erratic, inexplicable symptoms that defy a surface diagnosis, you order a comprehensive metabolic panel. You look deep into the blood to find the underlying infection. I needed the financial equivalent of a full diagnostic workup. My parents possessed an intimate knowledge of my personal data. During my undergraduate years before my boundaries were forged in steel, Gary insisted on managing my federal student aid applications. He claimed the tax forms were too complex for a teenager juggling clinical rotations to navigate. I had handed over my social security number, my driver license details, and my digital signature authorizations with the naive trust of a daughter, assuming her father had her best interests in mind. Even after the estrangement took hold, those vital identifiers remained stored in his home office filing cabinets. They were weaponized potential waiting for a desperate moment. I navigated to the official portal for the primary credit reporting bureaus. I verified my identity through a rigorous series of authentication prompts answering obscure questions about old residential zip codes and former employers. The loading wheel spun a small blue circle rotating endlessly against a stark white background. The silence in my apartment felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums as I waited for the algorithms to fetch my history. The dashboard populated. My credit score sat securely in the excellent tier, a testament to years of disciplined budgeting and timely payments. I clicked the tab to generate a full line-by-line report of all active accounts. I scrolled past the familiar authorized entries. The auto financing for my sedan showed a flawless payment history. The consolidated student loans from nursing school were steadily shrinking each month. A single travel credit card carried a zero balance. I kept scrolling, tracing my finger down the smooth glass of the trackpad, verifying the foundation of my independence. Then my breath caught in my throat. The scrolling stopped. Nested between a closed utility account from my college apartment and an old cellular contract sat a glaring anomaly. It was a high-yield personal loan issued by a mid-tier regional bank based in the Chicago suburbs. The principal balance read $25,000. I blinked, forcing my eyes to refocus in the dim light, assuming the database had rendered a typographical error. The numbers remained unchanged. I clicked the expansion arrow to reveal the granular details of the trade line. The origination date plunged a spike of pure ice directly into my chest. The loan was opened exactly 3 years ago. 3 years ago, I was in the absolute deepest freeze of our estrangement. I had not spoken a single syllable to Gary or Brenda in 24 months. I was working 80-hour weeks at the hospital, entirely disconnected from their orbit. Yet according to this official federal database, I had walked into a suburban bank branch and signed away a massive portion of my borrowing power. The payment history indicated the account was currently 90 days past due. The status flashed in a harsh red font. The loan was hurtling toward a catastrophic default. The pieces of the puzzle began to snap together with sickening, undeniable clarity. The lavish invitation to the Wellington was never about reconnecting. It was never about a mother missing her estranged daughter. It was an elaborate, desperate legal trap. Gary and Brenda had forged my signature to secure $25,000, likely funneling the cash into one of my father's doomed real estate investments or my sister's failing retail boutiques. They had managed to make the minimum monthly payments for a while, keeping the fraud hidden in the shadows of the banking system. But their funds had dried up. The regional bank was undoubtedly sending collection notices threatening legal action and demanding the balance. They were cornered. To avoid a fraud investigation or a total financial collapse, they needed a lifeline. They needed to roll the debt over, refinance the principal, or secure a formal acknowledgement of the loan to legitimize the forged paperwork. They could not execute any of those maneuvers without my physical presence and a fresh signature. The extravagant steakhouse dinner was a calculated investment. They planned to overwhelm me with manufactured generosity, surround me with the nostalgic pressure of 20 smiling relatives, and ply me with expensive wine. At the end of the evening, Gary would have pulled a crisp stack of papers from his tailored jacket. He would have framed the documents as a simple tax discrepancy, perhaps a minor clerical error regarding old college tuition forms that required my immediate authorization to protect the family. They assumed the social pressure of the private dining room would compel me to sign without reading the fine print. They bet my desire for a restored family dynamic would blind me to the deception. The $6,000 they racked up in seafood towers and prime rib was merely the cost of doing business. It was a sunk cost designed to secure a $25,000 bailout. When I refused to play the role of the submissive daughter and walked out into the freezing wind, I did not just leave them with an unpaid restaurant tab. I obliterated their escape route. I left them handcuffed to a felony. Derek's unhinged behavior in the hospital waiting room finally made perfect logical sense. I was not risking arrest because his pride was wounded over a dinner bill. He was panicking because the entire house of cards was collapsing. If the bank initiated an audit on a defaulted loan bearing my forged signature, the investigation would lead directly back to Gary and Brenda. Derek knew his parents were facing potential federal indictments and catastrophic ruin. The smear campaign on social media, the crying videos, the hateful text messages from extended relatives all served as deliberate smokescreens. They were desperate attempts to intimidate me into compliance before the financial institutions tore their lives apart. They needed to break my resolve and force me back to the table so they could shove a pen into my hand. I sat in the cold glow of the laptop screen and felt the lingering traces of familial obligation evaporate completely. This was no longer a domestic dispute over boundaries or emotional neglect. This was a severe premeditated crime. My parents had stolen my identity. A defaulted loan of this magnitude jeopardized my professional licensing with the state medical board. It compromised the financial stability I had sacrificed my youth to build. I closed the laptop, allowing the sudden darkness to swallow the kitchen island. I did not shed a single tear. The sadness had burned away entirely, replaced by a cold, clinical resolve. They had constructed an intricate snare to destroy my future, but they had left a distinct paper trail. The diagnosis was complete, and the treatment plan required absolute ruthless precision. The morning after discovering the debt of $25,000 brought a profound stillness to my apartment. I woke up before my alarm sounded. Most people who uncover financial theft perpetrated by their own parents would immediately reach for their phone. They would call scream demand answers and unleash years of suppressed resentment. I did none of those things. I brewed a pot of black coffee and let the silence settle over the kitchen. In the trauma center, panic is the enemy of survival. The moment a clinician loses their composure, the patient slips away. I treated this crisis with the exact same protocol. I needed to isolate the problem, gather the necessary instruments, and prepare for a surgical removal of the threat. My smartphone sat on the granite island, vibrating steadily. The notifications poured in. Valerie sent a long message detailing how my actions at the restaurant had humiliated her in front of the waitstaff. Derek left an audio recording threatening to contact my landlord. They were focused on the $6,000. Their fixation with the steakhouse bill was a perfect smokescreen. They assumed I remained oblivious to the larger crime. I allowed them to keep believing that false narrative. I poured my coffee and let them punch the air. The irony of their outrage provided a strange comfort. They were mourning a ruined dinner while I was documenting a felony. My first objective required physical evidence. I took a personal day from the hospital citing an urgent family matter, which was technically accurate. I drove to a branch of the regional bank listed on my credit report. The building sat nestled in a quiet, affluent suburb, a brick structure projecting an aura of quiet security. I walked up to the teller counter and requested a meeting with a branch manager to review an active loan in my name. I kept my posture straight and my expression neutral, projecting the calm authority of a healthcare professional. A man named Peterson escorted me to an office with glass walls. I presented my driver's license, my passport, and my hospital identification badge. I asked for full copies of the original origination documents, including all signature pages and identification records used to open the account. Peterson clicked through his computer system and printed the file. He handed me a stack of warm, freshly printed paper. I reviewed the pages while sitting across from his desk. The theft was glaringly obvious. The address listed was my parents' suburban home. The contact number belonged to Gary. The most damning piece of evidence lay on the final page. The signature claiming to be Colette Hayes was a clumsy imitation. The loops and angles were fundamentally wrong, bearing the distinct heavy slant of my father's handwriting. I had used a copy of my old college financial aid application as a template, assuming the bank would not scrutinize the ink too closely. I thanked Peterson, placed the documents into a leather portfolio, and walked out of the bank holding the proof of their crime. The crisp pages felt heavy in my hands, holding the weight of their deception. The next step required establishing an official record. I drove directly to the local police precinct. Filing an identity theft report against your own family is a surreal experience. The precinct smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. A weary desk sergeant handed me a clipboard with a blue intake form. I sat on a hard wooden bench and filled out every line with meticulous accuracy. I detailed the fraudulent loan, the date of origination, and the suspected perpetrators. I did not let emotion blur the facts. I documented the timeline, the forged signatures, and the specific bank branch involved. A detective brought me into an interview room to review the statement. He asked if I understood the implications of naming my parents in a federal crime report. He warned me that once the paperwork entered the system, the momentum would shift out of my control. I looked at the detective and confirmed my understanding. I did not shed a single tear. I did not ask for pity. I simply wanted the incident documented under penalty of perjury. He stamped the report, handed me a carbon copy, and provided a case number. That case number was the cornerstone of my defense. The final component of my preparation required specialized legal expertise. I had scheduled an afternoon consultation with a prominent fraud attorney whose office overlooked the Chicago River. Her name was Evelyn. She possessed a reputation for dismantling complex financial deception with ruthless efficiency. I sat in her sleek, modern conference room and slid my portfolio across the polished wood table. Evelyn reviewed the credit report, the forged bank documents, and the police report. She leaned back in her leather chair, studying my face with a practiced, evaluating gaze. She noted that most clients dealing with familial fraud arrive in her office weeping, seeking a way to fix the relationship alongside the finances. I told her I had no interest in an apology or a reconciliation. I wanted unassailable leverage. I wanted a legal mechanism to permanently sever their access to my life and force them to assume the debt they had created. Evelyn appreciated the Midwestern pragmatism. We spent 2 hours drafting a comprehensive strategy. We would not send a cease and desist letter. We would not alert them to our findings. We would build a trap so airtight that they would have no choice but to surrender. Evelyn explained the specific federal statutes they had violated and outlined the potential prison sentences associated with wire fraud and identity theft. We compiled all the evidence into a single devastating file. The contrast between my calm planning and my family's chaotic anger could not have been sharper. They were operating on raw emotion and bruised egos. I was operating on statutory law and certified documents. I returned to my apartment as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the living room. I set my keys in the ceramic bowl. I took the documents Evelyn and I had organized and placed them inside a fresh manila folder. I picked up a black marker and wrote my own name across the tab. I placed the folder deliberately on the center of my kitchen counter. It sat there, a quiet beige rectangle holding the power to dismantle my entire family tree. It represented the boundary they could never cross again. My phone buzzed again, vibrating against the granite. It was another text from Brenda. She complained that the interest charges on the credit cards they used at the steakhouse were going to ruin their monthly budget. The dramatic irony was almost suffocating. They were losing their minds over a dinner bill while a staggering felony charge hung directly over their heads, suspended by a thread they did not even know existed. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the folder, feeling a profound sense of clarity wash over me. My restraint felt like a physical weight, but it was a necessary burden. Confronting them prematurely would give them time to fabricate a defense or attempt to destroy evidence. I had to wait for them to make the next move. Their arrogance would inevitably push them to escalate the conflict. They still viewed me as the submissive daughter they could manipulate through intimidation, They had no idea they were poking a bear that had already locked the cage doors. I picked up a glass of water and drank, feeling the cool liquid soothe my dry throat. The trap was set. The paper trail was secure. All I had to do was maintain my silence and let their unearned confidence guide them into the snare. I knew they would not be able to resist taking another shot at me. Their pride was too damaged. The only question was how they would choose to deliver their next demand. The answer arrived a few days later, carried by a postal worker, proving that their audacity truly knew no bounds. The bitter chill of early December had finally settled over the city, turning the Chicago wind into a physical barrier. I finished a grueling 12-hour rotation, a shift spent navigating the delicate balance of epidurals and general anesthetics. My mind craved the quiet sanctuary of my apartment. I navigated the icy sidewalks of the South Loop, my breath pluming in the frigid air, seeking the warmth of my building. As I approached my front door, I noticed a bright slip of paper taped to the wood, a notification from the Postal Service regarding a missed delivery. The notice required a signature for a certified parcel. I redirected my steps toward the neighborhood post office before it closed. The clerk handed over a thick, stiff envelope. The heavy thud of the rigid cardboard hitting the service counter resonated with an unexpected finality. I looked at the return address printed in stark black ink. It bore the official seal of the Cook County Circuit Court. I carried the parcel back to my apartment, laying it gently on the granite island, next to the manila folder containing the identity theft evidence. I did not tear the cardboard in a panic. I retrieved a slender metal letter opener from a drawer and sliced through the adhesive seal with surgical precision. I extracted a stack of stapled documents, smoothing the crisp pages under the warm glow of the pendant lights. The header identified the paperwork as a formal summons for small claims court. The plaintiffs listed were Gary and Brenda Hayes. The defendant was Colette Hayes. I read through the specific allegations outlined in the brief. My parents were officially suing me for $6,000. The itemized charges were almost comical in their audacity. They claimed theft of services, asserting that I had verbally promised to finance a family gathering and then intentionally abandoned them, causing severe financial harm. They added a secondary claim for intentional infliction of emotional distress, arguing that my sudden departure had caused my mother profound public humiliation and psychological trauma. They had paid filing fees, hired a process server, and initiated a binding legal action over a dinner bill. I stood in my kitchen and read the pages a second time. I did not cry. I did not experience a spike in my heart rate. Instead, a genuine, unforced smile broke across my face. The sheer, breathtaking irony of the document rested in my hands. My parents were utilizing the justice system to extort a few $1,000s from their daughter, entirely unaware that the same daughter was currently holding irrefutable proof of their $25,000 felony. This tactic aligned perfectly with my father's historical behavior. Gary had always wielded the threat of litigation as a blunt instrument to intimidate people he perceived as weaker than himself. When I was 14, he hired a local contractor to replace the siding on our house. When the work was finished, Gary refused to pay the final installment, citing imaginary defects in the craftsmanship. He drafted a cease and desist letter filled with legal jargon he had copied from the internet, threatening to sue the contractor for property damage. The contractor, a hardworking man who could not afford the loss of income or the cost of an attorney, eventually walked away from the debt just to escape the headache. Gary boasted about that victory for years. He viewed the legal system not as an arbiter of truth, but as a weapon for the ruthless. I was applying that exact same methodology to me. He assumed a young professional woman, someone whose career depended on a clean background and an impeccable public standing, would panic at the sight of a court summons. He calculated that the sheer anxiety of facing a judge, combined with the lingering societal shame of a public family dispute, would force me to capitulate. In his mind, I would write a check for $6,000 just to make the intimidating paperwork disappear. He failed to realize that medical professionals do not panic when presented with a crisis. We analyze the variables. We isolate the threat. By filing this lawsuit, Gary and Brenda had committed a catastrophic tactical error. In the state of Illinois, small claims disputes routinely mandate an official mediation session before a judge will ever hear the case in a courtroom. The legal system requires both parties to sit in a neutral room with a court-appointed mediator to attempt a settlement. My parents believed they were dragging me into a space where they could corner me, pressure me, and force a financial concession. They thought the formal setting would rattle my nerves. They did not understand that they had just constructed their own gallows. They had voluntarily requested a documented, legally binding environment. They had handed me a closed room, a captive audience, and an official witness. It was the perfect, pristine theater to drop the identity theft bomb. If I confronted them in a coffee shop or a living room, they could easily deny the forged loan scream over my accusations and storm out the door. In a mandated mediation session, they would be forced to sit across a table and face the undeniable reality of their actions on the official record. I would not just present my defense against their frivolous claim. I would present the terms of their surrender. I placed the court summons directly into the manila folder, merging their petty grievance with their federal crime. The trap was now fully operational. However, my meticulous training dictated that a successful procedure requires preparing for every conceivable complication. If I was going to dismantle them in that mediation room, I needed to ensure their small claims suit evaporated on its own merits before I even introduced the forged bank loan. I needed to prove their narrative of the steakhouse dinner was a fabricated lie. The burden of proof rested on my shoulders, and the word of a daughter against her aging parents would not suffice in a legal setting. I required objective, indisputable evidence that the extravagant feast was ordered without my consent, and prior to my arrival. I needed a timeline that could not be cross-examined or disputed. I pictured the polished mahogany interior of the Wellington. I recalled the dim lighting, the clinking crystal, and the chaotic aftermath of my departure. More importantly, I remembered the quiet, weathered floor manager who had shielded the check presenter from view. Vince had recognized the predatory nature of the gathering before I even whispered my intentions. He had witnessed the ambush firsthand. His perspective held the key to neutralizing my father's lawsuit. I checked my schedule for the upcoming week. I had a rare Tuesday afternoon off, a brief window of time before the evening dinner rush consumed the restaurant staff. The strategy required a delicate touch. I could not simply march into the establishment and demand their internal records. I needed to approach the situation with the same respect and professional courtesy the manager had afforded me. I needed an ally who understood the bitter reality of familial exploitation. I poured myself a glass of cold water, feeling the chill trace a path down my throat. The initial shock of the certified mail had entirely dissipated, leaving behind a profound sense of purpose. My parents had spent their entire lives treating my independence as a threat to be neutralized. They had finally pushed the boundary far enough to trigger an irreversible consequence. I looked at the beige folder resting on the dark granite countertop. The paper trail was growing compiling a narrative of deception that would soon reach its devastating conclusion. I turned off the kitchen pendant lights, allowing the city glow to filter through the blinds. Tomorrow I would return to the scene of the crime, not as a victim seeking a refund, but as a tactician securing the final piece of ammunition. The Tuesday afternoon light filtering through the windows of the Wellington carried a pale, muted quality. I pulled open the heavy brass door and stepped inside. The establishment felt entirely different during the midday prep hours. The theater of wealth and corporate power had not yet begun. Instead of the low hum of executives closing deals, the dining room echoed with the rhythmic sounds of hospitality preparation. Waitstaff folded crisp white napkins over their forearms. A porter ran a silent vacuum across the plush carpet. The air smelled of lemon polish and the rich, savory depth of veal stock simmering in the distant kitchen. I walked past the empty host stand and made my way toward the main bar. The dark mahogany surface gleamed under the recessed lighting. A bartender stood at the far end, meticulously wiping down a row of crystal highball glasses. I approached the polished wood and asked if Vince was available. The bartender paused, assessed my professional attire, and nodded toward a hallway leading to the administrative offices. He picked up a landline phone and quietly relayed my request. Less than 2 minutes later, Vince emerged from the corridor. He wore a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing forearms etched with faded tattoos. He lacked the tailored charcoal jacket he wore during the evening service, but he carried the same quiet, uncompromising authority. He spotted me standing by the bar. His footsteps slowed. A flicker of recognition crossed his weathered features. He did not look annoyed by the unannounced visit. He walked behind the mahogany counter, grabbed a ceramic mug, and picked up a steaming carafe. Vince poured the black coffee with practiced grace. He set the mug on a small beverage napkin and slid it smoothly across the mahogany bar. The ceramic surface radiated a comforting warmth against my cold fingertips. He poured a second cup for himself and leaned his forearms against the polished wood. He asked what brought me back to the scene of the crime. His tone carried a dry Midwest pragmatism. I took a sip of the coffee. It was bold and scorching. I appreciated his direct approach. I did not waste his time with emotional preambles or long apologies for my family. I laid out the facts with clinical precision. I explained that my parents had initiated a formal legal action against me. I detailed the specific allegations listed in the small claims summons. I told him Gary and Brenda were seeking $6,000 for theft of services and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I explained their claim that I had orchestrated the dinner promised to finance the luxury feast, and then abandoned them to face the consequences. Vince let out a low, humorless exhale. He stared into his coffee mug for a long moment. When he lifted his gaze, his eyes reflected a deep, abiding disgust. He told me he had worked in the Chicago hospitality sector for 3 decades. He had witnessed every conceivable variation of human entitlement. He had seen wealthy heirs verbally abuse hostesses and corporate vice presidents attempt to evade their tabs. But he noted that the behavior my family exhibited that Friday evening occupied a unique category of predatory behavior. He described the aftermath of my departure. He painted a vivid picture of my father demanding the staff hunt me down in the parking garage. He recounted how my sister Valerie attempted to sneak out through the service exit before a security guard intercepted her. He detailed the sheer panic that consumed the private room when he informed them the police would be summoned if the balance remained unsettled. Vince respected people who worked for their living. He recognized the calluses of 12-hour shifts and the exhaustion of earning your own way. He saw my parents for exactly what they were. They were parasites wearing expensive suits, attempting to drain the life out of a daughter who had actually built something real. He set his mug down and told me to wait right there. He turned his back and walked down the administrative hallway. I stood in the quiet restaurant listening to the soft clatter of silverware being sorted in the kitchen. In American culture, blood relations are often elevated above all other bonds. Society demands loyalty to your parents regardless of their behavior. Yet my own flesh and blood had forged my signature to steal $25,000 and filed a lawsuit to extort $6,000 more. They viewed me as a resource to be consumed. Meanwhile, a floor manager I had spoken to for less than 60 seconds recognized my integrity and treated me with profound respect. True allies frequently emerge from unexpected places, while the people supposed to protect you are busy sharpening their knives. Vince returned 5 minutes later. He held a thick white envelope bearing the embossed logo of the Wellington. He placed it on the mahogany bar and tapped the paper with his index finger. I explained the mechanics of a modern restaurant point-of-sale system. Every time a server inputs an item into a digital terminal, the software generates an immutable timestamp. The system records the exact hour, minute, and second a specific dish or beverage is ordered. The data cannot be altered or erased by the floor staff. Vince had accessed the archived digital ledger for the private dining room. He printed the itemized order tickets for the entire evening. He opened the envelope and slid the crisp pages toward me. The columns of data told an irrefutable story. The 3 multi-tiered seafood towers, the 4 bottles of vintage champagne, the tomahawk ribeyes, and the truffle butter were all entered into the kitchen queue at a very specific time. I cross-referenced the digital timestamps on the order tickets with the electronic log from the host stand, documenting my arrival. My family had finalized their luxurious $6,000 order exactly 45 minutes prior to my entry into the building. The paperwork provided absolute mathematical proof that I had zero involvement in the procurement of the feast. I could not have promised to pay for a meal that was ordered nearly an hour before I even surrendered my wool coat to the coat check. The documentation obliterated Gary's frivolous legal claim. It transformed his lawsuit from an intimidating threat into a verifiable act of perjury. Vince did not stop there. He pulled a second document from the envelope. It was a formal statement drafted on the official letterhead of the establishment. He had typed a sworn affidavit detailing his first-hand observations of the event. He signed his name at the bottom in bold blue ink, attesting that I had consumed no food, drank no beverages, and informed the management of my non-involvement immediately upon assessing the situation. He verified that I had exited the premises without partaking in any services. He slid the envelope across the bar. He offered a firm nod of solidarity. He told me to take them to the cleaners. I thanked him. I placed the envelope into my leather work tote, feeling the immense weight of the ammunition I had just secured. I walked out of the steakhouse and back into the biting winter air. The trap I was building for the mandated court mediation was now flawless. The time-stamped receipts would serve as the opening salvo, dismantling their fake grievance before I unleashed the crushing reality of the federal identity theft. I held all the cards. I controlled the entire board. I returned to my shift at the hospital, feeling a profound, steady calm. I monitored my patients' adjusted intravenous drips and documented vital signs with sharp focus. I let the days pass in total silence. I ignored the lingering text messages and the blocked voicemails. The absence of my reaction was beginning to erode my parents' confidence. The small claim summons was supposed to force me into a panicked surrender. My refusal to acknowledge the legal threat meant their intimidation tactic had failed. The silence deafened them. They needed me to engage. They needed to gauge my emotional state before they sat across from me in a legal setting. They realized the aggressive approach had yielded zero results, which meant they had to pivot. As my phone vibrated in my locker near the end of the week, displaying a new, unexpected notification, I knew their strategy was shifting. The predator was about to put on a mask of pure manufactured grace. The fluorescent lighting in the hospital staff locker room buzzed with a low, steady frequency. I sat on the varnished wooden bench, untying my clinical shoes after a grueling 14-hour shift. My physical energy was depleted, but the hypervigilance required to navigate my family remained highly active. I reached into my locker and retrieved my smartphone. The screen illuminated the dim space, displaying a single new notification. It was a voicemail from my mother. The duration counter read 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Throughout my childhood, Brenda and Gary operated utilizing a strict, predictable binary. Gary supplied the overt intimidation. He levied the ultimatums, threw his financial weight around, and drafted the threats. Brenda functioned as the soft closure. Whenever Gary pushed a situation to the brink of a permanent fracture, Brenda would swoop in with a fragile, weeping demeanor. She played the role of the beleaguered peacemaker. She would corner me in this kitchen, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, claiming she was caught in the middle of a terrible conflict. She would beg me to concede just a fraction of my boundaries to restore harmony in the household. It was a highly orchestrated routine. They played opposing roles to extract resources from their children under the guise of familial compromise. I tapped the play icon and pressed the speaker to my ear. Brenda's voice filled the quiet locker room. The audio quality captured a breathless maternal tone layered heavily with manufactured sorrow. She began by sighing a long theatrical sound designed to convey profound emotional exhaustion. "Colette, honey," she whispered. The false endearment grated against my nerves like sandpaper. She paused, allowing a synthetic sob to break her sentence. "This has all gone too far. Your father is a proud man. You know how his pride gets the better of his judgment. Filing that court paper was a terrible mistake. It is tearing me apart to see my family fighting in the public eye like this." She continued spinning an elaborate narrative of maternal suffering. She claimed she had spent the entire week arguing with Gary, pleading with him to drop the legal action. She positioned herself as my secret advocate, fighting a valiant battle behind closed doors to protect my reputation. Then she pivoted smoothly to her actual objective. "Let us just put this ugliness behind us," Brenda murmured, her voice dripping with artificial grace. "We do not need judges or courtrooms or legal fees. We are flesh and blood. Meet us this Saturday at the quiet coffee shop near the old house. Just the three of us. If you can just pitch in half the cost of the restaurant bill, it will soothe your father's wounded ego. We can sign a quick financial release to put the lawsuit to rest, and we can finally move forward and heal." The proposition hung in the air, a perfectly constructed poison apple. To an untrained ear, it sounded like a genuine olive branch. To a daughter who had spent years funding their lifestyle, the deception was glaringly transparent. I lowered the phone to my lap. The sheer audacity of the scheme was striking. They had realized their intimidation tactic failed. The court summons was supposed to force me into a panicked, immediate settlement. When I met their legal threat with total silence, the reality of the impending mediation session began to terrify them. A court-appointed mediator would require sworn statements and documented evidence. My parents knew their narrative regarding the steakhouse feast would disintegrate under official scrutiny. More importantly, they were running out of time. The $25,000 loan they had fraudulently secured in my name was hurtling toward a catastrophic default. They needed my signature to roll the debt over or refinance the principal balance. They could not present a forged banking document in a municipal courthouse with a magistrate present. They needed to pull me out of the formal legal system and back into the informal emotional arena where they historically held all the leverage. The quiet coffee shop meeting was the actual snare. They intended to slide a stack of papers across a cafe table, burying the loan extension authorization beneath the small claim settlement agreement. They calculated that a daughter eager to resolve a bitter family dispute would sign the pages without reading the fine print. They wanted to trade a $3,000 concession for a $25,000 felony cover-up. I pictured Brenda practicing that voicemail. I imagined her sitting at her kitchen table, sipping a glass of wine, adjusting her tone to ensure the tears sounded authentic. She believed her maternal performance was flawless. She believed she was reeling me back into the boat. I opened a new text message window. I did not draft a lengthy reply. I did not address her tears, nor did I acknowledge the blame she placed on my father. I utilized the clinical precision required to document a patient chart. The Midwest culture values direct, unvarnished communication, and I was about to deliver a flawless execution of that principle. "We will not meet at a coffee shop," I typed. "I have received the court summons. I will adhere to the legal process you initiated. We will discuss all financial grievances at the mandated mediation session on the official record with legal counsel present. Do not contact me outside of this designated forum." I read the text twice to ensure the tone offered zero emotional leverage. I pressed send. The green bubble vanished into the cellular network, carrying my final boundary directly to their screens. By sending that message, I effectively locked the doors to their escape route. I stripped away the emotional battlefield and confined them to a space governed by evidence and perjury laws. They had built their own gallows when they paid the filing fee for the small claims suit. Now they were legally compelled to climb the steps. My fraud attorney. Evelyn had warned me this pivot would happen. She predicted my parents would attempt to settle the matter informally once the reality of the court date loomed closer. Evelyn advised me that any private meeting would compromise our leverage. Forcing them into the mediation room guaranteed their actions would be documented on an official legal ledger. My refusal to meet them in a casual setting cemented the trap. I gathered my belongings, zipped my heavy wool coat, and walked out of the hospital. The freezing Chicago wind whipped across the dark pavement, cutting through the layers of my clothing. I did not shiver. I felt a radiating, steady warmth in my chest. The anxiety that used to accompany any interaction with my parents had evaporated. I was no longer the vulnerable student begging for basic respect. I was the architect of their impending accountability. The days leading up to the mediation session passed with a quiet, deliberate pace. I reviewed my files with Evelyn. We organized the time-stamped steakhouse receipts, the manager's sworn affidavit, the forged bank loan documents, and the active police report. We placed each piece of evidence into separate sterile manila folders. The preparation felt remarkably similar to organizing a sterile tray for a complex surgical procedure. Every instrument had a specific purpose. Every move was calculated. My parents did not attempt to contact me again after receiving my text message. The silence from their end indicated a profound shift in the power dynamic. They realized the old tricks were no longer effective. They were walking into a legal proceeding blind, assuming their daughter was merely being stubborn about a dinner bill. They had no idea I was bringing a federal crime to the negotiating table. I had set the final table and I was ready to serve them a reality they could never escape. The Chicago River carved a dark, icy path through the grid of downtown skyscrapers. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows in Evelyn's conference room, watching a heavy barge push through the freezing water. The late afternoon light cast long, pale, geometric shadows across the polished oak table behind me. We were 48 hours away from the mandated court mediation. The time for gathering intelligence had concluded. We were now assembling the instruments for the procedure. Evelyn sat at the head of the long table, her posture radiating a calm, practiced competence. She did not operate with frantic energy. She moved with the deliberate focus of a legal professional who knew she held the winning hand. Between us rested a stack of pristine, heavy stock paper. These loose pages represented the total deconstruction of my parents' manufactured reality. I walked away from the window and took a seat beside my attorney. Evelyn opened a black leather-bound portfolio. She placed a heavy metal 3-hole punch over the first set of documents. The mechanism pressed down, carving perfect circles into the margins of the paper. She aligned the pages over the open metal rings of a thick binder. Snap. The crisp, clean snap of the binder ring locking into place echoed in the quiet conference room. It sounded like a heavy vault door sealing shut. We organized the trap chronologically. The first tab contained the official small claims summons Gary and Brenda had filed detailing their frivolous claim for theft of services. The second tab held the silver bullet provided by Vince. The time-stamped order tickets from the steakhouse rested beneath a clear plastic sleeve displaying the irrefutable mathematical proof that the extravagant feast was ordered exactly 45 minutes prior to my arrival. Behind those tickets lay the manager's sworn affidavit printed on official letterhead. Those 3 pages alone would dismantle my father's civil lawsuit in front of the magistrate. They would humiliate him on the public record and expose his perjury. The civil suit was merely the superficial wound. We moved to the third tab, inserting the diagnostic imaging of the deeper cancer. Evelyn filed the official identity theft report I had generated at the police precinct. Next went the credit bureau printouts displaying the $25,000 fraudulent account. Finally, we added the bank origination documents bearing the clumsy forgery of my signature. This section transformed a petty family grievance into a documented federal crime. The contrast between the 2 halves of the binder was stark. The first half proved my parents were liars. The second half proved they were felons. I ran my fingertips over the textured black cover of the binder. A profound sense of weight settled into my shoulders. This collection of paper was the culmination of a 5-year journey. I closed my eyes and let the memories of the past half-decade surface. I remembered the bone-deep exhaustion of my nursing residency. I remembered the endless succession of night shifts, the harsh smell of sterile scrub fluid, and the jarring sound of the pager pulling me out of a brief 15-minute slumber in the break room. I had sacrificed the entirety of my early 20s to build an autonomous life. I had survived on generic coffee and thrift store scrubs, counting every single penny to ensure I never had to rely on another human being for my survival. I missed holidays, birthdays, and social gatherings to study pharmacology and human anatomy. During those years of intense isolation and labor, my parents were dining at prestigious restaurants and funding doomed retail ventures for my sister. They viewed my grinding labor as their ultimate safety net. They assumed the daughter who worked 60 hours a week would eventually yield returning home to finance their indulgence. They believed generational entitlement was an unbreakable law of nature, an unspoken contract where the young sacrificed their future to fund the reckless mistakes of the old. They were mistaken. I realized, sitting in that law office, that I was not just fighting to clear a fraudulent debt from my credit history. I was fighting to sever the chain of exploitation permanently. If I allowed them to walk away with a minor reprimand or a private settlement, they would simply regroup and find another avenue to drain my resources. The only way to cure the disease was to excise the infected tissue entirely. Evelyn closed the portfolio and slid it across the oak table toward me. She offered a brief affirming nod. She advised me to review the documents one final time to familiarize myself with the sequence of the reveal. We discussed the specific cadence of the upcoming meeting. She explained the layout of the municipal mediation rooms and the standard procedures of the court-appointed officials. She detailed our tactical approach. She would handle the procedural introductions with the mediator. I would maintain total silence until the trap was fully primed. We knew Gary would attempt to hijack the conversation immediately. We knew he would deliver his rehearsed lecture on respect and duty. We knew Brenda would feign maternal injury and dab her eyes with a tissue. We would give them the rope, and we would let them tie the knot themselves. I left the law office and rode the elevator down to the lobby. The winter evening had descended, blanketing the city in a biting chill. I walked to my car carrying the leather binder against my chest. It felt like a shield. The 48 hours leading up to the mediation moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I worked my scheduled shifts at the trauma center. I intubated patients, monitored vital signs, and maintained my clinical detachment, utilizing the hospital routine to anchor my focus. My phone remained silent. The false olive branch had withered, and my parents were likely spending their days rehearsing their victim narrative for the magistrate. When the morning of the mediation finally arrived, I woke before dawn. The sky over Lake Michigan was a bruised slate gray. I brewed a pot of coffee and stood in my kitchen, savoring the quiet warmth of my apartment. I needed to select my wardrobe for the day. In the corporate culture of downtown Chicago, a high-stakes legal meeting typically demands a specific uniform. People wear tailored wool suits, silk blouses, and expensive leather shoes to project power and intimidate their opponents. My sister Valerie would undoubtedly arrive wearing a designer blazer she could not afford, wielding her appearance as a weapon of status. My father would wear his finest bespoke suit, attempting to project the illusion of immense wealth to sway the mediator. I opened my closet and bypassed the formal attire. I had no intention of playing their game. I was not walking into that room to perform a role or project artificial dominance. I was walking in to deliver the truth. I chose my standard, unassuming everyday wear. I pulled on a pair of dark tailored denim jeans and a simple high-quality black cashmere sweater. I selected a comfortable pair of leather boots with a low, practical heel. I did not wear flashy jewelry or apply heavy makeup. I tied my hair back into a neat, functional style mirroring the way I wore it beneath a surgical cap. The psychology behind the choice was highly deliberate. A power suit signals a desire to dominate the room through external projection. My authority did not originate from a price tag or a brand name. It originated from the irrefutable evidence secured inside the black binder resting on my kitchen island. Dressing plainly signaled that I had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. It demonstrated that I was unbothered by the performative wealth my family worshipped. I poured the last of my coffee into a travel mug. I checked the address of the mediation center on my smartphone. The facility was located in a municipal building just a few blocks from the commercial district. I picked up the heavy leather portfolio, feeling the solid weight of the documents shifting inside. I walked out of my apartment and locked the deadbolt. The drive through the city traffic was slow, allowing the anticipation to build in a steady, controlled crescendo. The radio played softly in the background, a low murmur of morning news that barely registered in my mind. I navigated the familiar grid of streets, arriving at the designated parking structure with 20 minutes to spare. I turned off the ignition and sat in the silent cabin of my car. I placed both hands on the steering wheel, taking a deep, calculated breath. The air in my lungs felt clean and sharp. The anxiety that had plagued my teenage years, the suffocating fear of my father's wrath and my mother's manipulation was entirely absent. I checked my pulse. It was even and strong. I picked up the binder, opened the car door, and stepped out into the freezing wind. I was ready to walk into the fire. The Municipal Mediation Center occupied the 14th floor of a brutalist concrete building in the downtown judicial district. I pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into a space designed to neutralize emotion. The reception area featured beige carpets, gray acoustic ceiling tiles, and the low mechanical hum of an overworked ventilation system. The environment was intentionally devoid of warmth. It existed solely to process human conflict into binding legal agreements. Evelyn waited for me near the security checkpoint. She carried a slim leather briefcase and wore a structured charcoal blazer. We exchanged a brief silent nod. We did not need to review our strategy. We had engineered every step of this encounter, and the time for planning was over. A court clerk directed us down a long, narrow hallway lined with identical doors. We stopped at conference room 4. I turned the brushed steel handle and walked inside. My parents and my sister were already seated on the opposite side of a long faux wood laminate table. The visual contrast between our factions was immediate and striking. Gary wore a custom-tailored navy pinstripe suit, his silver tie knotted with precise symmetry. A gold watch caught the harsh fluorescent light above us. Valerie sat next to him, draped in a cream-colored designer jacket, her posture projecting supreme confidence. Brenda occupied the chair on his other side, clutching a woven silk handbag, her face arranged into a mask of weary sorrow. They had dressed for a performance of wealth and injured dignity. I sat down across from my father, smoothing the front of my plain black cashmere sweater. I placed the heavy black binder directly in front of me. Evelyn took the seat to my left, resting her hands calmly on the table. A court-appointed mediator sat at the head of the table. He introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, a retired judge with graying hair and a tired professional demeanor. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and explained the ground rules of the session. He stated that mediation provided an opportunity to resolve the civil dispute without the time and expense of a courtroom trial. He emphasized that the process required good faith negotiations from both parties. Gary did not wait for the mediator to finish his opening remarks. He picked up a heavy silver fountain pen from the table. He depressed the mechanism at the top with his thumb. The sharp metallic click echoed in the quiet room. He viewed my presence as a formal surrender. In his mind, the plain clothes I wore signaled defeat, a stark contrast to his own expensive armor. He believed the anxiety of the legal system had finally broken my resolve. He clicked the pen a second time, projecting a casual, arrogant ease. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and addressed Mr. Sterling while keeping his eyes locked on my face. "Thank you, sir." Gary began, his voice dropping into a smooth, practiced cadence. "We appreciate your time today. To be frank, it breaks my heart that a private family matter has escalated to this level. But my wife and I were left with no other recourse. We are dealing with a severe breach of trust." He launched into a rehearsed monologue, spinning the narrative of the steakhouse dinner with breathtaking audacity. He painted a picture of two elderly, loving parents who had traveled downtown to celebrate their daughter's career. He claimed I had explicitly offered to finance the evening as a gesture of reconciliation. He described the devastation they felt when I vanished without a word, leaving them humiliated and financially burdened by a staggering $6,000 bill. "It was a cruel stunt," Gary stated, shaking his head with manufactured disappointment. "A stunt pulled by a young woman who forgot the sacrifices her family made to put her in a position of success. We taught her the value of hard work. We supported her through nursing school. And she repaid us by intentionally abandoning us in a public setting." Brenda reached into her silk handbag and extracted a pristine white tissue. She dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes, performing her role perfectly. Valerie nodded in solemn agreement, glaring at me across the laminate surface. I remained perfectly still. I did not interrupt him to correct the timeline. I did not defend my work ethic or remind him that he had thrown my college financial aid letter into the garbage. I utilized the clinical silence I had perfected in the trauma center. When a patient is under sedation, you monitor their vital signs and allow the medication to take effect. You do not argue with the monitors. You simply watch the data unfold. My silence emboldened him. Gary interpreted my lack of a defensive response as submission. The rhythmic click of his silver pen continued, a steady metronome marking the depth of the grave he was digging for himself. "We do not want to ruin her career with a messy public trial," Gary continued, adopting a magnanimous tone. "We are reasonable people. We simply want accountability. We believe in family responsibility. If Colette is willing to reimburse the $6,000 today, we will withdraw the small claims suit entirely. We can close this unfortunate chapter and move forward." Mr. Sterling took notes on a yellow legal pad. He turned his attention to me, likely expecting the standard pushback or a counteroffer. Before the mediator could ask for my response, Gary raised his hand, halting the flow of the conversation. "There is just one minor administrative detail." Gary added, his tone growing dangerously casual. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. He extracted a short stack of stapled paperwork and slid the documents across the table toward the mediator. Since we are formalizing a financial settlement, I brought a standard release form for Colette to sign, Gary explained. It is just some old tax paperwork linked to a college loan from years ago. It requires her updated signature so we can clear the books on our end. If she pays the restaurant bill and signs this standard release, we will drop the lawsuit immediately. A clean slate for everyone. I looked at the stapled pages resting near Mr. Sterling's hand. I recognized the formatting of the regional bank. Gary was attempting to pass off a high-yield personal loan extension as standard college tax paperwork. He was asking me to legally bind myself to $25,000 of fraudulent debt in exchange for dropping a $6,000 frivolous lawsuit. The sheer predatory nature of the offer was stunning. He was attempting to execute a felony cover-up in front of a court-appointed official. Mr. Sterling reviewed the proposed settlement document. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the legal boilerplate. He did not possess the context to recognize the fraud. To the mediator, it appeared to be a routine, albeit complex family financial dispute. He slid the paperwork across the table until it rested in front of me. Ms. Hayes. Mr. Sterling said, his voice neutral and professional. Your father has presented a settlement offer. You have the floor to respond. Do you accept these terms, or would you like to present a counterproposal? I looked at the forged bank extension. I looked at Brenda, who was watching me with hungry, anxious eyes. I looked at Valerie, whose smug smile had faltered slightly under the weight of the silent room. Finally, I looked at Gary. He clicked his silver pen one last time, resting his hands on the table, awaiting his victory. I had built his entire strategy on the assumption that I would fold under pressure. He believed I lacked the courage to dismantle him in a public forum. He thought his bespoke suit and his rehearsed speech had secured his dominance. Evelyn sat quietly to my left. She did not reach for the paperwork. She did not whisper advice in my ear. We had planned this exact sequence. She was waiting for my signal. I placed my right hand on the heavy black binder resting in front of me. I let the silence stretch for 5 long seconds, allowing the tension in the room to reach a fragile breaking point. I will not be signing that document. I stated, my voice echoing clearly against the bare concrete walls. And I will not be paying the $6,000. Gary let out a sharp, condescending sigh. He leaned forward to launch into another lecture on my supposed stubbornness, ready to wield the threat of a prolonged court battle. He opened his mouth to speak. I unclasped the metal lock on this black binder and flipped the heavy leather cover open. I turned the first thick plastic divider of the black binder. The harsh fluorescent light reflected off the protective sleeve holding the time-stamped restaurant tickets. I slid this initial packet out from the metal rings and pushed it across the laminate surface toward the mediator. The crisp pages settled directly next to the fraudulent settlement offer my father had just presented. I spoke directly to Mr. Sterling, ignoring the exasperated sigh escaping my father's lips. My parents filed a small claim suit alleging I promised to finance a dinner, and then abandoned them. I stated, maintaining a steady, even cadence. The documents I just provided are the official point-of-sale records from the Wellingtons secured directly by the floor manager. They are accompanied by his sworn, notarized affidavit. Mr. Sterling picked up the pages, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses to inspect the data. If you review the timestamps on those order tickets, I continued, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the quiet room. You will see that the 3 seafood towers, the 4 bottles of vintage champagne, and the prime steaks were entered into the kitchen queue exactly 45 minutes before I walked through the front doors of the establishment. It is mathematically impossible for me to have ordered, promised to pay for, or orchestrated a feast that was consumed prior to my arrival. Gary stiffened in his chair. The rhythmic clicking of his silver fountain pen ceased instantly. He opened his mouth, attempting to formulate a rebuttal, a blustering excuse about a misunderstanding regarding the reservation time. Now wait a minute, the timeline is not what it seems. He started, his voice lacking its previous polished resonance. You do not have the floor, I interrupted. My tone was sharp and authoritative, mirroring the exact voice I utilized to stop a surgical resident from making a fatal error in the operating room. Gary snapped his jaw, shut, his cheeks flushing a deep, uneven red. Mr. Sterling scrutinized the receipts, comparing the printed times to the sworn affidavit. The mediator's neutral expression hardened into a look of professional disdain. He recognized perjury when it sat on his table. The frivolous civil suit was officially dead. It was time to introduce the fatal injection. I turned to the third tab in my binder. I withdrew the second, much thicker stack of documents. This collection contained the official police report, the credit bureau analysis, and the forged bank origination files. I held the thick packet in my right hand for a fraction of a second, letting the weight of my 5-year exile rest in my palm. Then I dropped the file onto the table. The heavy, unmistakable thud of the paper hitting the hard laminate surface echoed against the bare concrete walls. I slid the packet across the table. It came to rest inches from Gary's manicured hands. "I am not here to negotiate a frivolous dining bill," I said, my gaze shifting from my father to my mother. "I am here to address a $25,000 felony." The blood drained from Brenda's face, leaving her skin a stark ashen gray. Her woven silk handbag slipped from her lap, hitting the carpeted floor with a muted thud. She did not reach down to retrieve it. Valerie, who had been sneering just moments before, leaned forward, her eyes scanning the top page of the news stack. The bold header of the identity theft report was clearly visible. The smug, entitled arrogance that had defined my family for decades evaporated in an instant. It was replaced by raw, suffocating terror. 3 years ago, during a period when we maintained zero contact, you utilized my old financial aid records to secure a high-yield personal loan. I explained, mapping out their crime with clinical precision. You forged my signature on the origination documents. You routed the funds to an address you controlled. You managed the minimum payments until your liquidity dried up, and now the account is 90 days past due. I pointed a single finger at the settlement release Gary had attempted to slip past the mediator minutes earlier. The document you just tried to coerce me into signing is not a standard tax release, I stated, exposing the depths of their deception. It is a loan rollover authorization. You orchestrated the steakhouse dinner and subsequently this entire legal mediation to trick me into legitimizing your fraud before the regional bank initiated a federal investigation. Mr. Sterling pulled his hands away from Gary's proposed settlement offer, as if the paper had suddenly caught fire. The retired judge understood his position. He was no longer mediating a civil dispute over a restaurant tab. He was witnessing the presentation of federal evidence regarding wire fraud. He pushed his chair back slightly, distancing himself from the criminality sitting on the opposite side of the table. Gary began to stammer a broken, desperate sound that stripped away his bespoke suit and his gold watch, revealing the hollow coward underneath. "Colette, you cannot do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking as he reached out toward the police report, but stopped short of touching it. "We are your family. We were going to pay it back. It was a bridge loan to help your sister with a commercial lease. We just needed more time." I did not let him finish his pathetic rationalization. "I have already filed a formal report with the Chicago Police Department," I informed them, watching the panic solidify into sheer dread. "I have retained specialized legal counsel sitting right beside me to pursue this matter to the fullest extent of the law. Identity theft and bank fraud carry mandatory minimum prison sentences in this state." Brenda let out a ragged, trembling gasp. She reached for Gary's sleeve, her fingers digging into the expensive wool fabric. Valerie stared at her parents in horrified realization, understanding that the financial well had not just run dry, but had become a radioactive crime scene that could implicate her failing businesses. However, I continued, lowering my voice to a cold, flat register that commanded the entire room. "I am offering you a singular alternative." Evelyn, sitting silently to my left, unclasped her leather briefcase and extracted a final, pristine document. She placed it squarely in the center of the table. "That is a binding legal confession," I instructed, dictating the terms of their surrender. "It stipulates that you committed the forgery, and it transfers the $25,000 debt entirely into your names, forcing you to assume full legal and financial responsibility. You will contact the bank today with my attorney present on the phone to restructure the debt under your own Social Security numbers." I reached into my pocket, withdrew a simple black pen, and placed it on top of the confession. Furthermore, I added, delivering the final non-negotiable boundary, You will sign a permanent, irrevocable no-contact order. This injunction bars you, Valerie and Derek, from ever approaching my residence, my workplace, or my person again. You will never text me, call me, or utilize third parties to reach me. If you violate this order, the identity theft file goes straight to the authorities. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands calmly in my lap. I looked at the three people who had spent my entire life viewing me as a resource to be harvested. They looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. You have two choices. I told them, the finality of my words hanging in the sterile air. You sign those papers right now, assume the financial ruin you created, and walk out of my life forever. Or we stand up, walk out of this room, and my attorney hands this entire file directly to the district attorney for felony prosecution. You have 60 seconds to decide if you want to spend your retirement in a state penitentiary. The 60 seconds I offered them stretched into a suffocating, dense silence. The ticking of a wall clock amplified the profound shift in power. My father stared at the black pen resting on the table as if it were a venomous snake. His tailored suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame, his posture collapsing under the weight of an inescapable choice. The illusion of family unity. A facade they had fiercely maintained for decades splintered and disintegrated right in front of the mediator. Gary was the first to break. The instinct for self-preservation overpowered any remaining loyalty to his wife. He turned his head toward Brenda, his face twisting into a mask of cruel accusation. He pointed a trembling finger at her silk blouse. He told the room that the forged application was entirely her initiative. He claimed she had procured my old university tax forms and drafted the signatures while he was traveling for business. He insisted he only learned about the illicit funds after the transfer cleared the bank. Brenda gasped, her manufactured sorrow evaporating into genuine venomous outrage. She slapped his hand away, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. She reminded him that the money went straight into his failed commercial property investments. She accused him of forcing her to make the phone calls to the loan officer. They bickered like cornered animals, throwing decades of shared resentment onto the laminate surface. Valerie reacted with sheer self-interest. She pushed her chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the carpet, attempting to create physical distance from her parents. She looked at Evelyn and Mr. Sterling, frantically declaring that her retail boutiques were independent entities. She insisted she had zero knowledge of the identity theft and begged to be excluded from any impending criminal investigation. She threw the people who had funded her entire lifestyle directly under the bus to save her own reputation. I sat motionless and watched the empire crumble. For my entire life, they had projected an image of unshakable authority, demanding my obedience and my resources. Now stripped of their leverage and facing the severe consequences of their greed, they revealed their true nature. They were not powerful figures. They were cowards eager to destroy one another to avoid accountability. Evelyn checked her wristwatch. She cleared her throat, a sharp, authoritative sound that severed their bitter argument. She informed them that 30 seconds had elapsed. She reminded them that the district attorney maintained a dedicated task force for financial crimes, and the evidence file was ready for immediate submission. Gary looked at the thick stack of printed evidence. He looked at the stark, undeniable proof of his forgery. The reality of a federal indictment finally pierced his arrogance. His hands shook as he reached across the table and picked up the black pen. He did not utter another word of protest. He uncapped the pen and pressed the tip to the confession document. He traced his signature on the dotted line, legally binding himself to the $25,000 of debt he had created. He turned the page and signed the permanent injunction, relinquishing his access to my life. He slid the paperwork toward Brenda. She wept, her tears smudging her carefully applied makeup. These were not the performative tears she utilized to manipulate me in the past. These were tears of profound defeat. She signed her name, her handwriting jagged and uneven. Valerie eagerly signed her portion of the boundary agreement, desperate to extract herself from the blast radius. Evelyn retrieved the signed documents. She inspected each signature for accuracy, verifying the dates and the printed names. She placed the legal confession and the boundary orders into her leather briefcase, securing the brass latch with a final echoing click. The trap was officially closed. The threat to my medical license and my financial stability was permanently neutralized. I did not offer a parting lecture. I did not demand an apology or gloat over their humiliation. A person who holds true authority does not need to announce their victory. I stood up from my chair, smoothed the fabric of my black sweater, and picked up my coat. I offered a brief, respectful nod to Mr. Sterling, thanking the retired judge for his time. I turned my back on my parents and my sister. I walked out of the conference room and let the heavy door shut behind me, severing the connection forever. I rode the elevator down to the lobby in comfortable silence. Evelyn offered a warm smile before heading toward her vehicle, assuring me she would handle the bank restructuring call with Gary later that afternoon. I pushed through the revolving glass doors of the municipal building and stepped out onto the Chicago pavement. The transition from the sterile, suffocating air of the mediation center to the vibrant pulse of the city was intoxicating. The winter evening had fully arrived. The neon signs of downtown storefronts cast colorful reflections across the damp asphalt. The elevated train rumbled overhead, vibrating the concrete beneath my boots. The crisp, biting chill of the wind hit my face. It did not sting or cause me to shiver. It felt remarkably clean. It felt like pure, unadulterated freedom. I joined the flow of pedestrians navigating the busy sidewalks. For years, I had carried the invisible weight of their expectations. I had worked double shifts and lived in cramped apartments haunted by the fear of their next demand. I had allowed their voices to dictate my anxiety. Now those voices were permanently silenced by a legal barrier they dared not cross. The space they used to occupy in my mind was suddenly empty, leaving room for a profound, abiding peace. I did not have to scream or match their volume to win. I merely had to refuse their fabricated reality and enforce my own. They had mistaken my quiet Midwestern stoicism for submissive weakness. They failed to realize that the discipline required to keep a patient alive in a trauma bay is the exact same discipline required to excise a toxic element from your personal life. I turned a corner and spotted a small, independent cafe glowing with warm amber light. The scent of roasted espresso beans drifted onto the sidewalk. I walked inside, greeted by the low murmur of conversation and the soft hiss of a steaming wand. I stood at the counter and ordered a simple dark drip coffee. The barista smiled, processed my payment, and handed me a plain paper cup. The transaction cost exactly $3. I held the warm cup in my hands and walked toward a window seat facing the bustling street. I took a slow sip. The coffee was rich, bitter, and grounding. I thought about the luxurious spread at the Wellington. I thought about the towering tiers of oysters, the Wagyu beef, and the $600 bottles of vintage champagne. My family had engineered that extravagant feast to trap me, believing the sheer cost would force my compliance. They were right about one thing. That dinner carried an astronomical price tag. But the $6,000 they were forced to drain from their empty accounts was not the true cost of their meal. The real price was much steeper. By pulling that stunt, they had handed me the exact leverage I needed to uncover their federal fraud. They had purchased their own exile. That decadent steakhouse dinner was the most expensive meal Gary, Brenda, and Valerie would ever eat, because it cost them their favorite victim. They had consumed their final free ride. I rested my elbows on the wooden cafe table and watched the city lights blur through the condensation on the window pane. I felt solid, secure, and utterly unbothered. The relentless cycle of manipulation and guilt was broken, replaced by a quiet, ordinary evening that belonged entirely to me. I took another sip of my inexpensive coffee, savoring the warmth spreading through my chest. The ultimate revenge was not seeing them face ruin, or watching them turn on each other in a sterile room. The ultimate revenge was sitting in a warm cafe enjoying a simple drink on my own terms, knowing my permanent peace had finally begun.
I have spent a lot of time thinking about that sprawling mahogany table at the Wellington, nestled against the biting Chicago wind. I think about the cracked lobster shells, the empty bottles of vintage champagne, and the profound, deafening silence that followed when the illusion of a family finally collapsed. On the surface, the story of Colette Hayes is a gripping thriller of financial fraud and high-stakes boundaries. But if we look closer, peering through the shattered glass of that $6,000 steakhouse dinner, we uncover a much deeper, more haunting reflection on the very soul of modern American parenting. We live in a culture increasingly intoxicated by materialism. In the frantic pursuit of the modern American dream, success is too often measured by designer labels, luxury cars, and the ability to command a room with a premium credit card. But what happens when pursuing a glossy exterior corrodes a family's core? What happens when parents, blinded by their own ego and the desperate need to maintain a facade of wealth, begin to view their children not as souls to be nurtured, but as assets to be liquidated? The steakhouse ambush merely manifested a deeper spiritual bankruptcy. In a traditional American family structure, roles are meant to be sacred, rooted in a mutual covenant. Parents are the protectors, the guides, the steady anchors in a chaotic world. They should model honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness for the next generation. Yet Gary and Brenda represent a tragic deviation from this ideal. They fell into a trap that snares far too many parents in our modern society, the commodification of their own flesh and blood. When consumerism takes the wheel, losing one's moral compass becomes terrifyingly easy. Children subtly transform into retirement policies, financial safety nets, or tools to fund their parents' unresolved ambitions. But true parental morality is rooted in unconditional love. Bringing a child into this world is not issuing a loan that must be repaid with interest. True ethical parenting is about sheltering, nurturing, and eventually giving your children the wings to fly away entirely free of your own baggage. When we exploit our children's innate loyalty and weaponize their legendary Midwest work ethic to cover our own debts, as Brenda and Gary did, we commit a grave moral violation. We steal not just their money, but their future. Resilience is heavily romanticized in American culture. We praise relentless hustle and bootstrap mentalities, but true unshakable courage requires more than physical stamina. It requires the emotional fortitude to face the darkest, most insecure parts of oneself, to look in the mirror and acknowledge one's own limitations without blinking. The tragedy of Colette's parents is fundamentally one of extreme cowardice. When faced with financial ruin and the severe consequences of their own poor choices, they lacked the basic emotional awareness to admit defeat. Instead of acting with honesty and humility, they chose identity theft. They chose to maintain their hollow, prideful exterior, even if it meant destroying their daughter's credit, jeopardizing her medical license, and sacrificing her peace of mind. For parents today, this lesson is urgent. The greatest legacy you can leave your children is not a trust fund, but the example of a life lived with integrity. It takes immense internal strength to own your failures so that your children do not have to carry them. Raising kids requires the emotional intelligence to say, "I made a mistake, and it is mine to fix." A family can only be a true sanctuary when it is built on the bedrock of personal responsibility, rather than the sinking quicksand of fragile egos. Perhaps the most powerful element of Colette's story is the quiet, devastating wisdom she displays in the face of absolute betrayal. She does not resort to screaming matches. She ignores the digital smear campaigns. She simply observes the cause and effect of her family's actions and responds with airtight clinical boundaries. Eastern philosophies profoundly emphasize letting go. When we adapt this to the Western modern family dynamic, it becomes a crucial tool for survival and growth. This is not abandonment, it is profound respect. It is about understanding that true fairness means allowing your children to reap the rewards of their own labor rather than harvesting their success to cover your own failures. Colette embodies this wisdom. She sees through the hypocrisy and refuses to be swept away by anger or toxic sentimentality. She uses her intellect and her understanding of fairness to draw a line in the sand, using police reports and legal documents, cutting the cord of generational trauma without ever having to raise her voice. There is a vital lesson here for guiding and eventually releasing our children. Parenting requires the wisdom to recognize our limits. Forcing our children to carry the weight of our unfulfilled dreams or financial blunders will only result in total catastrophic estrangement. The pinnacle of parental wisdom is recognizing that our children do not belong to us. They belong to their own futures. Learning to let go of the need to control them and respecting their independent existence is the highest form of love we can offer. The most valuable inheritance we can pass down is not wealth, but a blueprint for living with unyielding integrity, deep emotional awareness, and the courage to take responsibility for our own storms. As we navigate the complexities of raising families in an era obsessed with the superficial, we must constantly turn our gaze inward. Are we building homes based on unconditional support and fairness, or are we constructing fragile empires built on the backs of our children's sacrifices? Are we brave enough to face our own reflections when the vintage champagne runs dry? If Colette's journey resonated with you regarding family responsibility or the legacy you are leaving, please join our community. Drop a comment below, share your thoughts, and subscribe to Fluffy Revenge for more stories that explore the quiet triumphs of everyday people. But before you close this page and step back into the rush of your own life, take a moment to pause. Think about the mahogany tables you have sat around. Think about the unspoken contracts you have signed with your own family and the heavy expectations resting on your shoulders or the ones you have placed on your children. In the end, when the grand feast is over and the bill finally arrives, who is truly paying the price? And more importantly, if you were handed that leather folder tonight, could you honestly say you owe them nothing?